fire upon earth. Religion. On a bright Sunday morning in July 1885, a white mob lynched Harris Tunstall behind the Methodist Episcopal Church in Oxford, Mississippi. According to the Memphis Commercial Appeal, Tunstall, a black man, was hanged for a diabolical sexual assault on one of Oxford's most highly respected young ladies. The alleged assault had occurred in the very early hours of the day, and Tunstall was arrested for the crime shortly after. By 9 in the morning, crowds were gathering in town. The courthouse bell was rung and a large body of citizens, composed of ministers, lawyers, merchants and planters, and, in fact, men from all walks of life congregated in the town square. The young woman in question had identified Tunstall as her assailant, and a committee of best citizens, quickly organized to investigate the matter, had determined that Tunstall was guilty. At that point, the mob led Tunstall away from the courthouse to a tree behind the nearby church. He was there allowed a short prayer and a brief opportunity to say goodbye to family and friends who were present. Tunstall reportedly showed remarkable coolness, praying that God show mercy on his soul. As for the mob surrounding him, its members showed themselves to be orderly though clearly excited and indignant. The news report concluded with the stunning comment that the mob also seemed to appreciate the fact that it was horrible work for the Sabbath day, and that they were sending a spirit illy prepared before his God, and realized that human life is sacred and a human soul divine, yet they knew that they had duties to perform, and paramount to all others was the thought that they must protect their women. Tunstall's lynching is remarkable on several counts. Occurring in 1885, it was one of the first public lynchings in the post-Reconstruction period. It was committed openly near the center of town and involved a large number of spectators and participants from the town and surrounding county. The lynching is also remarkable for the way in which the mob organized, and the newspaper represented, the proceedings as both a quasi-criminal trial and execution and an evangelical church discipline. This mob felt compelled to impose the appearance of legality on the violence by including as part of the lynching ritual witness testimony, a 12-member jury, and the final farewell and prayers of the condemned. That this lynch mob conspicuously retained aspects of public execution speaks to the ways in which, especially in the early postbellum period, mobs saw themselves as extensions of the state. It also explains why members of the black community were present that morning. In addition, the lynching suggested the ritual of evangelical discipline whereupon the sinner is exposed, investigated, and finally, in this case violently and fatally, expelled from a sacred community of believers. What is most extraordinary about this lynching is that the lynchers, consumed with the desire to bring immediate vengeance against a perceived criminal in their midst at the very time when the people of Oxford would otherwise be congregating in their churches, were confronted with the fact that they were overstepping sacred bounds. They were thus compelled to justify their unholy actions as just the opposite, the noble protection of an even greater sanctity, that of Southern white womanhood. For this reason, the mob could not remain on the courthouse grounds. To do so would have been to contain the act of vengeance within the secular realm, an extra-legal version of a criminal trial and execution, and to engage in such a secular activity on the Sabbath would have seemed overtly blasphemous. But to move to the church was to embrace the holy sensibility of the day, to merge symbolically the mob's act of vengeance with the divine justice enacted in the evangelical church. White womanhood was the most precious icon, the black man its demonic transgressor, and the mob the instruments of divine wrath and retribution. As in most towns of the New South, religion permeated almost every aspect of life in Oxford. Most of the town's 2,000 inhabitants belonged to one of 6 Protestant churches, and revivals held at the Methodist campground just outside town drew crowds of people from all denominations, many of whom traveled from surrounding counties to camp there for a week at a time. Religious news, sermons, and lessons appeared regularly in the local papers, where Oxford evangelicals increasingly expressed concern that entertainments and social activities were threatening the town's moral and spiritual integrity. In this context, it is not surprising that these Southerners not only defended the lynching of Tunstall in spiritual terms but infused the 47 performance of it with Christian tropes and rituals. Oxford, Mississippi, was also the hometown of William Faulkner, who, in Light in August, written some 50 years after Tunstall's lynching, imagined the lynching of Joe Christmas as a similar act of religiously inflamed vengeance. The lynching of Christmas was modeled less on Tunstall's lynching than on the 1908 lynching of Nelsa Patton, which occurred in Oxford when Faulkner was 11 years old. Patton, an African-American bootlegger and petty thief, allegedly raped and murdered a middle-aged white woman who lived outside town by slicing her across the throat, just as Christmas Kills Joanna Burton in Faulkner's novel. According to the Memphis Commercial Appeal, upon Patton's arrest, the streets were thronged with men and boys, all armed, and a lynching became inevitable. Several county elites, including a local Methodist minister, pleaded with the mob to let the law run its course, but former U.S. Senator W.B. Sullivan roused the crowd with a call for swift vengeance. The men, with much effort, tore into the jail, and, when Patton fought back like a wild man, they shot him dead. The mob then dragged him through the streets to the courthouse yard, where they castrated him and hanged him from a tree. As the Jackson Clarion-Ledger reported, the white people of the community were determined to avenge the victim of the black brute's lust, and they went about it in a businesslike way. Although news reports represented Patton's lynching as a secular, businesslike affair, Faulkner reconceived it through the lynching of Joe Christmas as something holier, both a crucifixion and a last judgment, the expiation of Southern racial sins. As Christmas is castrated, the faces of the mob seem to glare with bodiless suspension as though from halos. In his determination to avenge white honor, their leader, Percy Grimm, is described as prophet-like, with the unearthly luminousness of angels in church windows. "Now you let white women alone, even in hell," he says to Christmas, who instead, as he lies dying, seem to rise soaring into their memories forever and ever. By 1932, when Faulkner published Light in August, white Southerners had perpetrated thousands of lynchings, many of which evinced a degree of sadism grossly at odds with Christian convictions. To be sure, some Southern Christians, like the minister who protested Patton's lynching, recognized the shameless hypocrisy of lynching. But, all too often, mobs and their defenders not only overlooked that hypocrisy but actively interpreted and justified their violence as the willful expression of God's vengeance, as in the lynching of Harris Tunstall. Defenders of lynching, however, typically did not need the backdrop of the church to characterize their actions in sacred terms, especially when the alleged crime involved any sort of sexual outrage against a white woman. It is rarely possible to determine the religious affiliations of lynchers, let alone spectators. Nevertheless, regardless of whether individual lynchers were church members, they lived in a culture steeped in evangelical Protestant beliefs and values. Christianity was the primary lens through which most Southerners conceptualized and made sense of suffering and death of any sort. It would be inconceivable that they could inflict pain and torment on the bodies of black men without imagining that violence as a religious act, laden with Christian symbolism and significance. Many African American writers, activists, and artists also conceptualized lynching as a Christian act, more specifically as a Christian sacrifice, to confront the violence and oppression enacted against them. By imagining lynching as a crucifixion and its victims as Christian martyrs, Black Protestants could claim African Americans as the true inheritors of Christian salvation and redemption and their white oppressors as unholy savages. A handful of white ministers and writers likewise recognized the continuities between the sacrificial murder of Jesus and the lynchings of African Americans, as Faulkner himself did in his depiction of Joe Christmas's lynching. Moreover, more recently, some scholars have posited lynching as a form of ritual sacrifice, and African Americans the scapegoats, through which white Southerners expiated their own sins and psychically restored a sense of communal purity and social order. Yet most white Southerners in no way perceived lynching as a form of sacrifice and certainly not as a crucifixion. To do so would have been to bestow on the black victim an elevated status utterly at odds with their own racism. Instead, defenders of lynching commonly represented the violence as a terrifying retribution, ordained and consecrated by God, against the black man's transgressions, certainly not their own. In their view, made apparent in the language and tropes they used to justify lynching, mobs were messengers of God's wrath, summoning all the tortures of hell for the black fiends and devils in their midst. In short, their conception of lynching evoked not the crucifixion but the last judgment. To recognize lynching in ways that would have made sense to those who perpetrated and defended the violence is to comprehend not only the reasons that mobs could calm religion mid public lynching in the so-called Bible Belt with impunity, but also why 49 they, and their spectators, so relished the torment and suffering of their victims. These notions of black sin and white righteousness were felt with particular urgency amid the profound transformations that Southerners were experiencing in the post-Reconstruction period. Indeed, the same sense of social upheaval that brought a rise in lynching also led to a growth in evangelical religiosity and moral reform efforts. The public defenses of lynching dovetailed with a rising evangelical concern that modern life posed a grave threat to traditional moral and sexual codes. Even the language that Protestants used to express their fears about sin and vice was remarkably similar to that used to justify lynching. They exhibited the same distress about moral and racial purity, and they evinced the same need to protect white women and children from moral and racial corruption. The evangelical alarm about moral disorder was thus inseparable from the broader distress that emancipation and urbanization had upended the traditional racial hierarchy. It was for this reason that white Southerners so often conceptualized the threat of black enfranchisement and autonomy as, above all, a dire moral threat to white purity, literally a physical assault on white homes and white women. In the minds of many white Southerners, black men came to personify the moral corruption that they believed to be the root cause of social disorder. Evangelical moral crusades that interpreted social flux and instability in terms of sin and morality set the climate in which white Southerners attributed racial conflict to an alleged black propensity toward immorality and licentiousness. They unleashed the full force of their fury against these black fiends through the blood rituals of lynching, rituals that created a veritable hell on earth. Lynching, in this sense, acted as more than a form of political terror that restored white dominance against the threat of black equality. It became a divinely sanctioned retribution for black sin, sin that threatened not only white authority but white purity and virtue. These rituals also did more than simply punish the black demon in their midst. Through their spectacular excess, they constructed a symbolic representation of white spiritual and moral superiority. Lynching rituals produced, in very stark and dramatic terms, dichotomies between black and white as damned and saved, sinner and saint, which came to define white supremacy. They gave visual form to white supremacist beliefs, allowing white Southerners to both perform and witness them. Just as in evangelical practice, in which the act of witnessing conferred truth and sanctification on the convert's rebirth and his entry into a communion of believers, the public ritual of lynching offered white Southerners a certainty of their own grace and a sense of belonging to a virtuous and consecrated white community. It is exceedingly doubtful if lynching could possibly exist under any other religion than Christianity, wrote Walter White, an anti-lynching activist and NAACP leader, in 1929. For White, it was no accident that the states with the highest levels of lynching were those in which the great majority of the church members are Protestants and of the evangelical wing of Protestantism as well. Not only had these churches indirectly given their approval to lynching and other forms of race prejudice, but the very nature of evangelical worship, for White, created a particular fanaticism which finds an outlet in lynching. Accordingly, White contended, no person who is familiar with the Bible-beating, acrobatic, fanatical preachers of hellfire in the South, and who has seen the orgies of emotion created by them, can doubt for a moment that dangerous passions are released which contribute to emotional instability and play a part in lynching. White's indictment of Southern religiosity was exceptionally inflammatory, but a number of lynching opponents expressed similar disdain that Southern white Protestant churches had not only remained relatively quiet about mob violence but had become vocal supporters of white supremacy. For instance, sociologist Arthur Raper, writing in 1933, rebuked Southern churches for failing to take a more active stance against lynching and leaving unchallenged the general assumption that the Negro is innately inferior and of little importance. For these critics, Christian leaders' acquiescence to Southern racial prejudices and their unwillingness to condemn mob actions in their own communities made them ultimately complicit in lynching. Some church leaders did at times actively oppose lynching by either confronting mobs or deploring lynching in their sermons or written editorials. Religion and lynching, Christianity and crushing, burning and blessing, savagery and national sanity cannot go together in this country. Good men must make choice sick between these, charged a 1904 editorial in the Wesleyan Christian Advocate, which served Southern Methodists in Georgia. The church does not need and cannot tolerate lynchers. That same year, the Reverend Whitley Langston, a Methodist minister in Statesboro, Georgia, convened his church members to condemn the lynching of Paul Reed in Wilkato in that city and published indictments against the violence in the local newspaper and in the Wesleyan Christian Advocate. Langston and other members of the church then published a resolution in the paper requesting that any church members who participated in the lynching come forward and withdraw without delay from our communion and membership unless they made a public confession of wrong and expressed penitence and contrition. Several members were in fact expelled, though a number of other members, in turn, quit the church in protest over the expulsion. These kinds of denunciations as early as 1904 were exceptional, however. During lynching's peak at the turn of the century, most Southern churches were resoundingly silent on the issue. In places where lynchings had occurred, available church records made no mention of lynching, nor did preachers mention them in their Sunday sermons, even when news of a lynching dominated the local press. It was not until the national mood began to shift against lynching in the 1910s and 1920s that ministers became more outspoken against lynching. By 1930, most church papers and official organizing bodies, such as the Southern Baptist Convention, had taken public stances against lynching. Even so, most ministers, especially in communities in which lynchings had just taken place, were reluctant to denounce lynching publicly. A 1935 questionnaire answered by some 5,000 ministers showed that only 3.3% had preached or worked against lynching in some way. As Raper noted, most simply felt that lynching was inevitable and that, in taking a stance, they would divide and alienate their congregations. For example, when Methodist minister the Reverend Schuler denounced a 1920 lynching in Paris, Texas, he did so in the face of advice of friends that such a course is unsafe for him. Even when evangelical leaders did speak out against lynching, they largely assented to the worst of white Southern racial views. Many, for instance, implied that lynching was an understandable, albeit unfortunate, consequence of black propensities toward crime and sexual violence. Methodist Bishop Atticus Haygood, after the 1893 lynching of Henry Smith in Paris, Texas, denounced lynching as a crime against God and man. Yet in the same editorial, Haygood asked for understanding of the infuriated mob faced with Smith's demoniacal cruelty against the little white girl who was tortured in the mad wantonness of guerrilla ferocity. This acquiescence to lynching, or at least to its mythologies, was due, to some extent, to the largely conservative, even reactionary, role that white Protestantism played in the South. To be sure, many church leaders in the New South considered themselves to be progressive and modern purveyors of God's Word, and many, likewise, sought active roles in redeeming Southern society from what they considered to be the worst effects of modernity. Nevertheless, their social outlook tended to enforce dominant social structures and beliefs, in particular, Jim Crow segregation, and, indeed, offer them religious legitimization. Moreover, their spiritual emphasis on personal sin and salvation ultimately meant that they abdicated any responsibility for alleviating widespread social inequalities and suffering, most glaringly in the case of lynching. As anti-lynching activist Ida B. Wells wrote, "Our American Christians are too busy saving the souls of white Christians from burning in hellfire to save the lives of black ones from present burning in fires kindled by white Christians." Walter White and other liberals did not condemn Southern Protestants simply for their passivity in the face of lynching, however. They also saw evangelical worship and lynching as twinned expressions of the South's utter backwardness, as cannibalistic and primal rituals that placed the South far outside the purview of modern civilization. Even less provocative critics, like Raper, believed that once the South modernized, that is, once its people became more educated and less poverty-stricken, its social institutions stronger, and its churches more liberal and enlightened, lynching would inevitably decline. Yet lynching and religiosity both surged in the postbellum period not because the South was standing still but because it was experiencing the fits and starts of modernization. As Southern towns and cities developed, largely because of industrial and commercial expansion, they produced new kinds of occupations, new social arrangements, and new forms of recreation that many emerging white working-on middle-class men and women embraced. Even so, these people feared many of the consequences of those changes, particularly those that threatened the social authority and advancement they desired. Above all, they feared that urban crime, as well as the consumption of alcohol, phenomena that were regularly racialized, placed white women and white homes in peril. Southerners embraced religion in this period, in large part, because it represented a form of stability and tradition, a safe haven, amid the political and economic turmoil around them. These anxieties likewise became the fuel that fed the rising success of moral reform efforts, especially prohibition, in this period, as evangelicals increasingly attempted to stem the tide of moral change by imposing traditional standards of behavior on New South citizens. For example, although Rome, Georgia, had been a center of cotton marketing since railroads entered the city in the late 1830s, the city was expanding its commerce and industry at the turn of the century, largely because of busy trade on the Coosa River. In 1900, the Rome Tribune boasted that the city's population had grown to 14,035, adding that every one of these 14,035 people are a part of the commercial and industrial life of Rome. In the previous 15 years, the city had seen the development of several industries, including cotton mills, a furniture factory, an iron furnace, and chemical works. In the 1890s, an electric trolley, an opera house, and a large park that housed a theater pavilion and a race course had been built. At the same time that white citizens in Rome celebrated the industrial growth that had brought wealth and development into the city, however, they began to worry about crime and vice, particularly among the young men who labored in these industries. The area near the river docks known as the Cotton Block was of particular concern. Most of the city's 13 saloons were located there, and young men and disreputable women of both races congregated in the neighborhood. Church life thrived in Rome in these same years. Between 1890 and 1900, membership in the First Baptist Church had increased 4 times as much as had the city population. The established Baptist and Methodist congregations built new and elaborate church buildings, while new churches sprang up around the city, including 8 other Baptist churches. Revivals and protracted meetings, lasting up to 8 weeks, brought thousands of worshippers to the city, especially when the celebrated evangelist and noted anti-liquor crusader Sam Jones, who had lived in Rome in the early 1870s, returned to town. This spiritual fervor was coupled with rising concerns about the impact of commercial greed and, most conspicuously, modern amusements on Christian virtue. Evangelical leaders shared and tapped into larger public anxieties about urban vice, and they attended to them through an alarmist rhetoric that urged fellow Christians to safeguard their homes and their souls against moral sin. Most young, middle-class whites, especially women, did not frequent saloons and pool halls, but some went to dances or played cards, activities that their parents deemed disgraceful and that evangelicals readily conflated with more licentious activities. As one Methodist minister intoned, petty problems, such as wine, cards, dancing, theaters, that arise to vex the soul, were lurking toward and finally led into the great world of unbridled license and sin. Because, like most white Southerners, evangelicals tended to believe that African Americans were more likely to engage in immoral activities than were whites, they interpreted the threats that modern temptations posed as decidedly racial ones. Although both white and black men frequented the saloons in Rome's Cotton Block, it was considered a more scandalous and unseemly activity for white men, particularly since to visit a saloon, even a segregated saloon, in that neighborhood was to blur racial boundaries. These fears also energized an evangelically based crusade to cleanse the city of the social evil of alcohol. In 1902, after fierce public debates, a city referendum closed all saloons and replaced them with a dispensary operated jointly by the city and county, a solution to the liquor problem that left those reformers who wanted total legal prohibition unsatisfied. In 1907 the state of Georgia went dry, which, although it effectively ended the controversies over the dispensary in Rome, brought new concerns about moonshining and blind tigers in the county. Amid this turn-of-the-century turmoil, white Romans lynched 3 African American men within a 15-month period, all for purported attacks on white women. The last of these occurred in April 1902, on the same day that the liquor dispensary opened, and involved an attempted assault on a 13-year-old girl in the city center as she was walking home alone near dark. That night, a mob of 150 captured her alleged assailant, Walter Allen, a waiter at a local hotel, hanged him from a telephone pole, and riddled his body with bullets, all under the glare of an electric street light. The following day, the Rome Tribune justified the lynching on the grounds that there is something in the Southern heart that will not tolerate the mistreatment of women. The purity and chastity of our women first, last and all the time, is now and ever shall be a Southerner's foremost thought. Lynching and religiosity were, in this sense, twinned expressions not so much of Southerners' rootedness in a primeval past but of their reactionary and conflicted responses to modern life. Indeed, evangelicals regularly imagine the petty problems of drinking and dancing as threatening to their sense of propriety, to their purity and chastity as were criminal assaults. In other words, they perceived white integrity as under physical assault from particular moral behaviors in modern life, behaviors that stood as very personal and visceral dangers to vulnerable souls and bodies. Ministers again and again warned against the harmful effects of worldly pleasures that could lead to spiritual death and wasted lives. One Roman minister, for instance, admonished that in sin the soul became blinded, calmed, diseased, betrayed, deadened. To describe a spiritual failing as physical suffering prepared believers to understand their individual conversion and salvation as a visceral transformation of the self. But to characterize sin as an assault on the body was also to raise the stakes for spiritual renewal, not just for the individual but for society as a whole. Language that figured white Southerners as under attack necessitated an aggressive defense. Evangelicals accordingly envisioned their spiritual mission to save individual souls as a physical salvation of bodies, most often feminine bodies. Religiosity allowed many white Protestants to anchor their own sense of moral integrity against this onslaught of modern temptations. That sense of moral integrity was often rooted in a nostalgic vision of a simple and virtuous past, what evangelicals deemed traditional values or old-time religion. Their nostalgia was manifestly tinged with white supremacy, especially as evangelical churches played a significant role in the public commemoration of Confederate heroism and glorification of the lost cause in this period. Evangelicals likewise interpreted and celebrated in decidedly spiritual terms the political redemption of the Democratic Party, which restored white power after what were considered the gross injustices of Reconstruction. Faced with the erosion of their traditional authority and values, most white Protestants did not retreat to the church simply to firm up their own moral resolve. Rather, they saw themselves at war with modern culture, believing that their own salvation demanded that they wage battle against not only their own sin but the immoral excesses of others. Although popular amusements had certainly represented a spiritual threat for evangelicals since the antebellum period, they initially countered that threat through a self-imposed exclusion from the secular world, governing only the moral behavior of church members, largely through the practice of church disciplines. But amid the rapidly changing world of the New South, churches found it increasingly difficult to discipline younger converts who, despite their evangelical devotion, refused to deny themselves pleasures that were accepted in larger society. Once church disciplines were no longer capable of containing the threat that secular amusements posed, evangelicals turned their focus to the moral welfare of secular society as a whole, spearheading ardent public crusades to regulate and legislate moral behavior. Evangelicals' new concern with the social world was as much about their own survival as it was about a sincere regard for what they perceived as a wayward society. Even so, evangelicals firmly believed that if religious faith and its claim to moral authority lost cultural force, then white Southern society would be laid to waste. That is why they so fervently expressed alarm that individual moral misconduct, petty problems, such as wine, cards, dancing, theater spelled social disaster. Even as Protestants resisted what they saw as the harmful effects of modern life, they were nevertheless implicated in the process of modernization they eschewed. That is, evangelical devotion, like lynching itself, was not simply a primal reaction against social change, it was also in and of those social transformations. Churches and other religious institutions owed their burgeoning numbers to urbanization, since city people could more easily attend church and participate in reform efforts than could those isolated in the countryside. Churches in towns and cities were also expanding into large administrative centers that provided educational and recreational services for their congregations. Moreover, often as a means to attract and maintain larger congregations, church leaders adapted themselves to modern behaviors and assumptions, appropriating the language, styles of engagement, and amusements of secular culture even as they used them to strike back at secular institutions and practices. In many ways, the exhortations against modern amusements heard again and again in Southern churches served as jeremiads that, in lamenting the changes in cultural values that modernization had wrought, provided psychological reconciliation to that very process of change. White evangelicals also regularly expressed the sense that they were under siege and waging battle against the secular world in unambiguously gendered and racialized language that reverberated throughout the rhetorical defense of lynching. They, for instance, often interpreted the threat of losing their cultural dominance amid competing values as a collapse of masculine vigor within the church. In turn, the evangelical duty to save lost souls, usually imagined as young women whose virtue was wasted by worldly pleasures, translated to a patriarchal duty to protect the honor of white women. This moral reform rhetoric allowed individual white male believers to connect themselves both to a larger Christian identity and to a white masculine identity, just as it came to define and construct for them what exactly manliness and moral righteousness meant. By using language associated with masculine power, strength, and vitality to describe church battles waged against sin and immorality, evangelicals were able to attract male converts and shore up their own sense of social authority, a need they especially felt in light of women's numerical domination in both churches and reform organizations. A masculine Christianity, in fact, justified evangelicals' social dominance, a dominance it could not have sustained if evangelicalism were associated with feminine weakness or docility. To this end, public reports commonly described preachers as strong, forceful, and powerful, especially in their condemnations of sin. The Reverend Charles Forbes Taylor, arriving in Paris, Texas, to preach at a Baptist revival, was photographed in a boxer's stance, his hand clenched in fists. Sam Jones was a celebrated evangelist not only for his entertaining manner but also for his fearless attacks on the sinful. Jones was remembered in one, perhaps apocryphal, story as quelling some prankish cowboys who disturbed an evangelical meeting he was leading with a single threat of eternal damnation. When Jones told the men that he would hurl them out the window, they promptly grew reverent. For Jones at least, saving souls was a contest over masculine dominance. Such public demonstrations of manly piety and faith were considered imperative precisely because of a supposed friction between evangelical virtue and masculinity. Southern evangelicals had long wrestled with the seeming contradiction between prescriptive Christian virtues, such as submissiveness, sacrifice, and purity, and virtues associated with Southern white manhood, such as power and assertiveness. As one evangelical noted in Rome, Georgia, if a young man has a good case of religion, he is generally known as a sissy in society. In what came to be popularized as muscular Christianity, evangelicals described battles against sin in violent and aggressive terms. A Methodist preacher in Lawrenceville, Georgia, for example, devoted one Sunday sermon in 1904 to the warlike or fighting propensities of the Christian. He asserted that the Christian should show the ferocity and prowess of a lion when his honor is at stake and the cause of Christ is assailed. There should be no compromise with sin and evil. He then attacked the Lawrenceville pool parlor. As concerns about modern temptations became more pressing, ministers frequently held men-only meetings in which social concerns were discussed. At one such meeting in Rome, Georgia, advertised for red-blooded men and as a challenge to every home-loving man in Rome, the preacher handled some life issues without gloves. For many white Southern middle-class and working-class men, evangelicalism, fused with masculine authority, also offered class respectability and an assurance of their own upward mobility. Emmett Cole, who wrote a series of religious columns for the Rome Tribune-Herald throughout the 1910s, was representative of this sort of male evangelical. In his weekly columns, Cole regularly protested what he saw as moral lapses in Southern society, lamented the irreverence and ill-breeding of the youth, and intoned against sin and vice of all sorts, especially the demonizing influence of liquor. At the same time, he repeatedly affirmed the masculine vigor of believers. He derided the moral coward as the most contemptible man in the universe and lauded those men who stand for righteousness against the powers of darkness. While the hellhounds are always turned loose on the man who takes his stand against evil, he noted, they are helpless when it comes to any harm to the character of real manhood. These columns offered Cole a certain amount of prestige within Roman society, though he was not a member of the elite or professional class. Rather, he had begun his adulthood as a tenant farmer out in the county, and at the time he wrote his columns, he was a salaried furniture salesman in his 30s, living in a mortgaged home with his wife and children. Religious piety offered him a sense of authority and respectability to match his emerging status as a middle-class man, a status he was clearly anxious about, as his repeated assertions of his own propriety and manliness attest. At the same time, he bemoaned the class factionalism and haughtiness in churches that betrayed the socialistic message of Christianity. Evincing a belief in class solidarity through Christian fellowship was yet another means for Cole to ensure his own social authority. This evangelical concern for both masculine authority and the moral virtue of Southern society was closely bound to white anxieties about racial dominance. The anti-liquor crusades were especially infused with racially coded language concerning purity, integrity, and class respectability. Indeed, these crusades gained force in the South because drunkenness and alcohol and drug-induced licentiousness were associated with the very worst of African American society. Stories of black bootleggers or owners of blind tigers, intoxicated or drug-crazed black drifters, and drunken fights between African Americans filled small-town and urban newspapers. Protestants repeatedly appealed to a sense of patriarchal duty in exhorting Southern men to protect their women and their homes from such threats. Images of an evangelical masculinity waging war against sin coincided with and fueled pro-lynching rhetoric that similarly intertwined ideals of masculine aggression, duty, and moral righteousness. They, in fact, lend sacred force to that rhetoric. An editorial in Wiggins, Mississippi, for instance, denounced whiskey as a monster on a march of deviltry and destruction and as the demon that has dug more graves and sent more souls unsaved to judgment. Like a predator, the piece continued, whiskey even enters an humble home to strike the roses from a woman's cheek. 5 months later, a black bootlegger, Will Moore, was lynched not far from Wiggins for allegedly killing a white lumber company superintendent, J. H. Rogers. Cole urged the Christian men of Rome to organize to drive blind tigers from our midst. And certain other evils with which we have to contend. He asked, why should we as citizens allow such things to exist in the same community where our wives and daughters have to live? Cole wrote this column days after, according to the Rome Tribune-Herald, a black man, crazed with drugs, terrified a crowd of whites, and 2 other black men attempted separate assaults on 2 white girls in the center of town, assaults that almost precipitated lynchings. This hyperbolic language was the same used to describe black criminals, the demons and beasts who broke into homes to defile white women's purity. This rhetoric had particular resonance in the culture of Jim Crow segregation, a system arranged to keep white bodies pure and uncontaminated through the physical separation from black bodies. In this scheme, the white body, especially the female body, was accorded an almost sacred status, its boundaries and borders requiring protection against any violation. Pro-lynching reports thus regularly set frightening images of dissolute black predators against the moral purity and Christian piety of their white victims. Charges of intoxication further inflamed white anger and provided an added justification for mob retribution. In his narrative of 3-year-old Myrtle Vance's rape and murder and Henry Smith's subsequent lynching in Paris, Texas, P. L. James noted that the little girl was last seen singing Jesus Lover of My Soul in her childish treble voice. He described Smith, in contrast, as devoid of any humanizing sensibilities. A quiet, industrious servant when sober, a fiend incarnate when in liquor. Once the girl's body was found, James recounted, all the energy of an entire city and country was turned toward the apprehension of the demon who had devastated a home and polluted an innocent life. Pro-lynching rhetoric also created an impression that all whites, despite their class status, were united in their moral superiority to the drunken and degenerate fiends in their midst. Nelsa Patton was lynched in Oxford, Mississippi, for allegedly murdering Mrs. McMullen, the wife of a tenant farmer who was serving a sentence in the county jail. Yet local reporters described Mrs. McMullen as a respected white woman and assured readers that although the family is poor, they bore a good reputation and that Mrs. McMullen was hardworking despite Mr. McMullen's apparent criminality. On the other hand, Patton, a known moonshiner who was in an intoxicated condition when he allegedly committed the murder, held an unsavory reputation and was a black fiend incarnate. In these ways, the defenders of lynching borrowed the language of evangelical moral crusades to justify, and sanctify, their own crusades against black depravity. But the actual rituals of lynching also uncannily reenacted evangelical church practices, including confessions and testimonials, attention to torment and suffering, and the act of witnessing, practices that publicly rehearsed narratives of human sin and divine judgment. Lynch mobs were not necessarily replicating these rites self-consciously. Nevertheless, the metonymic relationship between them imbued lynching with sacred meaning and even consecrated it as God's vengeance against moral and racial transgression. Evangelical faith was, of course, not theologically dependent on or based in ritual. For liturgically based Christians, such as Episcopalians and Catholics, salvation rested on adherence to moral precepts and the performance of ritual sacraments, but for evangelicals, salvation rested on emotional submission to God's grace, the experience of conversion or rebirth. Although evangelicals believed in living a morally pure life in obedience to scriptural command, moral virtue, in theory, did not ensure grace but rather flowed from the converted as a consequence and physical manifestation of his or her salvation. In turn, sin was primarily a reflection of the individual's rejection of grace. Evangelicals believed that God punished sinful behavior with such vindictive fury because it represented human disavowal of his power and his love. Similarly, the dominant sacraments and rituals within evangelical practice, baptism, communion, testimonial, and prayer, primarily acted as visible expressions of faith rather than as actions that shaped or brought about one's faith. In other words, the performance of sacraments did not lead to salvation but simply made manifest the believer's faith and state of grace. In practice, however, ritual was still important, even intrinsic, to evangelical faith. It was through ritual that individual believers came to feel the transformative experiences of grace and salvation and to experience a sense of belonging to a sacred community of the faithful. The public performance and practice of faith were thus central to the believer's sense of himself as a saved and purified Christian. For instance, the ritual of baptism, in which the minister submerged the newly converted under water, was a symbolic act of purification, making visible the convert's absolution from sin. But the frightening act of being pushed underwater also replicated the surrender to God, and to the Church, expected of the convert. The ritual, in this sense, not only represented the convert's spiritual transformation but produced a new social identity within the convert, as one who was now submissive to a higher authority and attached to a like-minded community of believers. Because evangelical rituals established social identities in this way, they needed to be public in order to have larger social meaning beyond the individual's personal commitment to God. Large crowds of converted and unconverted alike commonly gathered to watch baptisms and revivals, where evangelicals gave public, and often very dramatic and emotional, testimonials of their conversion experiences, significantly called witnessing. Within evangelicalism, witnessing referred to the speaker's relationship to the truth of God. He acted as a witness to divine grace, and was crucial to the evangelical's duty to proselytize non-believers. The spiritual truth revealed in the act of witnessing was reinforced because others, hearing and seeing it, were made witnesses as well. Lynching rituals operated in comparable ways to these kinds of evangelical rituals. Just as evangelical rituals did more than simply reflect or make manifest belief, lynching rituals did more than merely dramatize white supremacist ideology or attest to white solidarity. The performance of lynching created a spectacle of virtuous and sanctified white supremacy and brought individual whites together into a communal devotion to it. In some extraordinary incidents, like the 1885 lynching of Harris Tunstall in Oxford, Mississippi, lynch mobs evoked religious rituals conspicuously, which lent the violence a more striking appearance of divine sanction. In 1897, a mob in Hawesville, Kentucky, lynched Raymond Bushrod, a black man accused of raping and mutilating the daughter of a prominent planter, on a Sunday afternoon while a revival was taking place. The lynching took place in the courthouse yard, not at the revival, though, according to one report, the mob did its work in the broad opening glare of a Sunday sun and within a stone's throw of 4 churches. In recognition of the holy day, however, the infuriated mob paused so that Bushrod could confess his crimes and offer a long and fervent prayer on bended knee. That Bushrod was allowed to pray and compelled to offer a confession was not unusual. Lynch mobs at times gave their victims time to pray and, more frequently, wrought confessions from them. The hearing of the condemned's last words and prayers was a central ritual of the public execution, one that was carried over into lynching rituals. As noted in the previous chapter, lynchings often conspicuously reenacted, in perverted and exaggerated form, legal rituals of public executions, which were themselves overtly laden with religious meaning, except that, in lynchings, any power or privileges given to the condemned in a legal execution were stripped away. In most lynchings, the victim confessed after being beaten or tortured into admitting his guilt or as a desperate attempt to assuage the angry mob. Sam Holt, burned alive in Noonan, Georgia, in 1899, was pulled from the flames so that he would admit his guilt. Over 20 years later, in Nadina, Arkansas, the mob that burned Henry Lowry alive interrogated him as the flames scorched his body. According to one news account, as Lowry confessed, one man questioned him and another wrote answers down in a notebook. It resembled a courtroom scene with prosecuting attorney and court reporter. As this example makes evident, confessions lent lynching the trappings of lawful punishment and served to justify the mob's violence as rightful and warranted, despite that confessions were forced and were often obtained after the lynching was underway and not likely to be aborted. Newspaper reports and pro-lynching narratives took pains, however, to assure readers that these confessions were true. As in legal hangings, the insistence on confession also compelled the condemned to sanction and participate in his own demise. In a 1905 lynching in Waco, Texas, for instance, the mob asked Sank Majors, accused of assaulting a white woman, not only to admit his guilt but to agree that he should be hanged for his crime. These confessions also contain significant religious undertones. According to Ray Stannard Baker, before the mob lynched Paul Reed and Will Cato in Statesboro, Georgia, they paused to let the Negroes kneel and confess. Since Reed and Cato had already been convicted in a court of law, their confession at the lynching site undoubtedly had a function beyond establishing their legal guilt. Lynching victims often followed their confessions with pleas for mercy, if not from their captors, then from God, pleas that Southern newspapers regularly noted for their readers. When William Gibson was burned alive for the murder of a white woman in Corinth, Mississippi, in 1902, before a crowd of 5,000, newspaper reports printed the speech he made to the crowd, in which he not only confessed to his crime but sanctioned the lynching. "Ladies and gentlemen, I am up here this evening for this crime on me, and I am guilty of the crime," he declared. "I ask everybody to forgive me if they can. My heart has been troubled ever since the death of Mrs. Whitfield, and I deserve the punishment I am going to get." At that point, he began to pray, "Oh, my God, the time has come and I hope I will be able to meet you in heaven. Oh, God, I have prayed all night and all day long. I ask the Lord to be with me on this stand this evening and I thank Thee with all my heart." Whereas in the secular realm, confession leads to conviction and punishment, in the spiritual realm, confession leads to salvation and deliverance. When lynching victims confessed and then begged for God's mercy, their confessions had spiritual meaning for them. For white mobs and spectators, however, the black man's confession would not ensure his salvation, for it was assumed that, as a fiend and demon, he was already a hellish creature. Rather, the confession only demonstrated the righteousness of the lynching. Indeed, pro-lynching rhetoric commonly sanctioned mob violence as an enactment of divine law and justice. Because lynching participants and their defenders believed that secular law was inadequate to deal with the enormity of black crime, particularly rape, they conceptualized lynching as the worldly invocation of a higher law and a higher form of justice. After all, in their view, human law could not possibly prosecute demons, fiends, and inhuman brutes. As P.L. James explained regarding the lynching of Henry Smith, people wanted justice. The crime was beyond description in words born in even our prolific language. Our statute books held in all their pages of fact and precedent, no law worthy to mete out justice in such a case. Once the lynch mob formed as the solution of the problem, all the people resounded, "Amen." In acting out divine law, lynchers could perceive themselves as God's messengers, sanctified and redeemed as such. After Smith's lynching, another defender wrote, "It was nothing but the vengeance of an outraged God, meted out to him, through the instrumentality of the people that caused the cremation." Because these Southerners perceived the lynch mob's retribution against black transgression as God's retribution, they could also understand the tortures that the mob inflicted as bearing all the power of divine wrath. Mobs and their spectators insisted on extensive and prolonged tortures to ensure acute physical and emotional suffering, suffering that would have been audible, visible, and palpable to the watching crowd. When a member of the mob that lynched Lloyd Clay in Vicksburg, Mississippi, in 1919 wanted to shoot him dead, members of the crowd cried out, "Let him die slow." Similarly, when Henry Lowry tried to hasten his death by swallowing the hot coals surrounding him, the crowd kicked them away. As a mob burned Dan Davis at the stake in Tyler, Texas, in 1912, the spectators apparently grew restless because the flames took some time before they started to scorch Davis's feet. According to one report, they had waited so long to see him tortured that they begrudged the 10 minutes before his suffering really began. Davis had calmly said to the mob as they led him to the stake, "I wish some of you gentlemen would be Christian enough to cut my throat," but nobody responded. As the fire started, he screamed, "Lord, have mercy on my soul." For the lynching victim who prayed as he was strung up or as flames engulfed his body, his suffering was the physical manifestation of the spiritual tribulation that precedes salvation. He could thus interpret his pain and anguish as signs of his imminent sanctification. For the lynch mob, however, this process of sanctification was inverted, as the black victim's torment offered them, and the white crowd witnessing it, a sign of their own spiritual redemption. The physical torment and tortures inflicted on the lynching victim were, in this respect, crucial elements of the white crowd's own sense of moral and spiritual superiority. Per lynching reports and commentaries, for this reason, belabored the sufferings of the lynching victim, recreating for readers his cries of pain and unheeded pleas for mercy. Readers did not relish these sensational details simply out of voyeurism or sadistic pleasure, rather, the victim's suffering allowed them to feel their own spiritual elevation in contrast to the condemned's utter degradation. The victim's reaction to his suffering became further evidence of his moral inferiority and justification for his punishment. If he screamed, cried, or wept, his protestations were read as signs of his weakness, physical and moral, that sanctioned the violence against him. Descriptions of his pained frenzy also stood in counterpoint to the white men in the crowd, whom pro-lynching reports frequently characterized as calm, orderly, and determined. Alternatively, if he remained stoic or relatively calm, observers noted his brutishness, his fundamental inhumanness, which accordingly indicated the justness of the punishment. When Henry Smith kept repositioning himself on the burning scaffold to alleviate his suffering, James interpreted his movements as a demonic attempt to subvert death. Any human being, unsustained by the genius of evil, must have been overcome ere this, but not so with Smith. With a tenacity unequaled, he clung to his unhallowed life, he wrote. An eyewitness to the 1895 lynching of Robert Hilliard in Tyler, Texas, recalled with astonishment, Hilliard's power of endurance was the most wonderful thing on record. His lower limbs burned off before he became unconscious. The writer asked, was it decreed by an avenging God as well as an avenging people that his sufferings should be prolonged beyond the ordinary endurance of mortals? The black man's suffering was measured against not only the grim composure of the mob but also the suffering of the white woman who had endured his alleged assault. It was her suffering, after all, that ultimately justified the excessive tortures the mob inflicted. If the sanctity of white womanhood had been violated, that sanctity could be restored only through the unbearable torment and suffering of the alleged violator. In his account of Henry Smith's lynching, James described in considerable detail the imagined sufferings of Smith's alleged victim, Myrtle Vance. Then, as he lingered over the gruesome details of the mob's violence, he added, all this while the vision of the mutilated child was the actuating principle in these ominous proceedings. Smith begged the mob to shoot him, but, James noted, no one answered his charge, for he had been merciless, and in like measure must it now be meted unto him. Similarly, according to Baker, some members of the Statesboro, Georgia, lynch mob at one point suggested hanging the two men, but someone began to recite in a high-keyed voice the awful details of the crime, dwelling especially on the death of the little girl, Hodges's daughter. This narration of white suffering, spoken in a high-keyed voice as if to conjure audibly the little girl herself, worked the mob into a frenzy of ferocity, and the men chose to burn Reed and Cato instead. As noted lynching advocate Rebecca Felton asked, referring to cases of sexual assault, what is this death by rope, compared to the humiliation, ignominy and lifelong suffering of the innocent victim of the black man's outrage? Even if the black rapist were torn by red-hot pincers, or burnt with slow fire, his fate would be Elysian compared to the white woman's torment, she reasoned. This vengeance against white female suffering was more than secular retribution or an avenging of honor between worldly subjects. Lynch mobs and their defenders envisioned themselves as Christian soldiers, battling the evil in their midst, much as evangelicals waged war against vice and moral transgression. In the hangings, shootings, mutilations, and burnings that far exceeded the social need to avenge a crime and punish a criminal, lynch mobs were recreating divine judgment on earth, enacting the damnation they were certain the black criminal would be facing in death. After the Waco mob took St. Majors from jail, a member of the crowd reportedly shouted out, "New trial granted, and change of venue from Waco to hell." Or, as the San Antonio Express editorialized after Henry Smith's lynching, "The blood of the innocent has not cried to heaven in vain for vengeance. The black beast that ravished a white babe at Paris, Texas, has paid the penalty for his accursed crime, has perished at the stake, has passed through a hell of fire upon earth to the hotter flames of an eternal Hades hereafter." In imagining their victims as demons and sinners passing through hell on earth, the defenders of lynching were not simply resorting to Christian hyperbole to justify secular actions. Evangelicals, to be sure, also emphasized salvation and peaceful eternity, and religious experience was most certainly about joy, harmony, and comfort. But this reassuring language was regularly coupled with stern warnings about the wages of sin, eternal damnation, and God's inevitable judgment on humans' wicked and selfish denial of His grace. Indeed, a believer's salvation would offer such blissful reassurance only if the alternative was truly dreadful. Sermons that emphasized an eternal and torturous punishment for sinners indubitably inspired dread within believers, intensifying evangelicals' desire to perceive themselves as purified and saved by God's grace. Temptations that preachers so often associated with modern life, drinking, dancing, and other amusements, only exacerbated these fears, if not in terms of their own faith then in terms of the faith of less pious family members and friends. Lynching, however, could assuage these anxieties about white sin, since in recreating a hell on earth for black sinners, white Southerners transferred onto black men that which they so feared themselves. Those whites, in contrast, could feel and appear sanctified, despite their individual moral behavior. The rituals of lynching, like those of evangelical practice itself, could make them feel transformed and cleansed of their own sins. These elements of white sanctification, the confessions, the suffering, were performances that depended on witnesses. At a legal execution, when a condemned man on the gallows witnessed to the crowd surrounding him, testifying to his own sin and redemption, the reactions and responses of the watching crowd reinforced his sense of his own salvation. The act of witnessing substantiated his faith and his redemption by making it visible to others. The spectacle of a lynching served a similar purpose, yet, rather than testifying to the condemned's salvation, the confessions and sufferings of the black victims testified to the white mob's sense of its own divine righteousness. The spectators at a lynching were thus crucial to the social and spiritual transformation enacted in the lynching. Lynching reports paid particular attention to the composition and reactions of lynching crowds, noting their cheers as the victims suffered or their scrambles to get a glimpse of the mob's work. The Waco Times-Herald noted, for instance, that as Jesse Washington, lynched in Waco, Texas, in 1916, commenced to burn. Shouts of delight went up from the thousands of throats and apparently everybody demonstrated in some way their satisfaction at the retribution that was being visited upon the perpetrator of such a horrible crime. The same Waco reporter also observed, however, that not all these in the crowd approved. This observation in the Southern press was not unusual. Reports at times did note that spectators at lynchings were repulsed, turning away in horror and disgust. Yet, although they at times noted that individual spectators were shocked by the visible sight of torture, these reports assumed that their presence at the lynching signified their complicity. As members of a crowd, individual spectators, regardless of their personal feelings, provided the lynchers with an audience, a public before which they could enact their rituals of white redemption. In this sense, the boundary between participants and spectators in a lynching was porous, often literally, as spectators jumped into fire guns, stoke fires, or collect souvenirs, and figuratively, as a crowd of spectators created an image of a united white public before which lynchers could vindicate their actions. As with evangelical rituals, the presence of witnesses linked individual members of the crowd to a larger community of believers, in this case an imagined community of white Southerners of all classes and ages, united in their devotion to white supremacy. Lynching reports commonly focused on the diversity of the crowd at a lynching, including men from different occupations, from city and country, as well as women and children, not to highlight divisions within Southern society but, rather, to accentuate the unity of that society. As noted in the Oxford lynching of 1885, men from all walks of life congregated in the town square, becoming one large body of citizens. The Rome Tribune remarked that the mob that lynched Walter Allen was composed of citizens of high and low degree, without regard to friendship, politics or social standing. Despite its diversity, the mob was not a wild and frenzied crowd at all, but grim and determined, acting quietly and in an orderly manner. Reports like this both created a public perception of white solidarity and served to accord those of low degree a sense of social respectability and equality. The performance of a lynching thus created a symbolic representation of white supremacy, a spectacle of demonic and wicked black men against a united and pure white community. That those images coincided with evangelicals' impassioned exhortations against sin gave lynching sacred force and justification. Indeed, the imprint of Protestant language and tropes on lynching rituals and defenses imbued the violence with divine sanction and made it appear familiar and recognizable to a people immersed in Christian beliefs and values. Mobs could thus conspicuously flout the law and perpetrate what otherwise would be considered aberrant and grotesque acts of sadism while considering themselves to be righteous and moral citizens. The racial fears and anxieties that fueled both evangelical reform and lynching violence emerged from the disruptions and upheavals of traditional values and forms of authority that white Southerners were feeling with grave intensity in the modern South. Religious fervency and lynching were accordingly reactionary attempts to re-establish an old order. In that sense, Lynch mobs and their advocates had to impose the familiar Protestant notions of sin and retribution onto what were, in many ways, new forms of racial violence and new conceptions of white supremacy. But white Southerners also made abundant use of modern technologies of vision to represent the fictions of white supremacy. These technologies expanded the act of witnessing to a broader public, creating a witnessing that not only offered those fictions the aura of divine truth but also gave them the stamp of visual certainty.